Hello, everyone. My name's Adam. If you've not met me, I'm a contract Ruby and JavaScript developer based here in Bristol. And yeah, I think a few weeks ago we had a talk on Stimulus, and I asked a question as to have you used Stimulus Reflex. I've been hearing a lot of buzz about it, but never touched it myself. And the room just went silent. So I thought, I'm going to have a little bit of an investigation into this, find out what it's all about, and kind of report back. So this talk is very much a kind of introduction to Stimulus Reflex. It's something that I've started to play around with a little bit. It's got some really interesting concepts that are quite novel, that are worth sharing. But yeah, I think I'm only kind of dipping my toes into the water myself with it as well. So first of all, let's start off with what is Stimulus Reflex. Stimulus Reflex is a new way to craft modern reactive web interfaces with Ruby on Rails. So this is the sort of web applications that go a little bit beyond kind of turbo links, where you need a bit more interactivity within the site itself. So the description is quite a bit longer. The key parts are it works with WebSockets, and it's designed to eliminate the complexity imposed by full stack front-end frameworks. So these are frameworks like React and Vue.js. And in particular, I found kind of the duplication that you end up with by implementing them into your applications. It also makes some claims that I think are possibly misleading, at least aren't always the case. It makes some claims about the performance being 20 to 30 milliseconds, and allows you to build these high performance reactive user interfaces. And I think this can be the case in certain applications, probably the majority, to be honest, but only if you kind of use the tools right. And I'll kind of talk about different ways to do things with Stimulus in a minute. Okay, so before I kind of dive into it itself, I wanted to kind of compare it against the options that we've got on the table for building these kind of reactive web applications today. So, oops, I've jumped the gun. Go back one. There we go. You didn't see that, it's fine. So the first one is probably the most common, is your single page application approach. And I'll probably be saying Rails a lot here. This applies to any sort of backend. I'm going to use Rails as an example though. But this is where kind of Rails is just an API. And you've got a front end, which is React, Vue, or next week's must-have JavaScript framework, because they're ever changing. And you're just kind of communicating over HTTP. And you got a degree of separation here, like you got kind of your front end and your back end, but you've still got some shared concepts. For instance, if you're building a Twitter-like application, both your back end and your front end would need to know that there's a 280 character limit on posts, for instance. So yeah, we've got a few things shared, a few things that kind of have their own domain here, and everything talks over HTTP. Then we kind of got, I don't really know if there's a proper term for this, but this is the way that I've kind of tended to work over the last few years, which is a kind of JavaScript enhanced approach. So I really like using things like turbo links first, using all the tools that Rails provides us, and using UJS as well, and sending forms through remote true on forms and things like that. And there are a few things, for instance, I've got a map component on my product, Tech Talks, where you type an address and it brings up this little pointer, and you point on the location, that lend themselves better to being a React component. So that's kind of the way that I've done that. The issue with this is we've got a couple of things duplicated on the kind of server side or Railsy side. Our view templates, we might want to mutate the view as somebody's interacting with the page. We got the same kind of things with what I was saying about if we were building a Twitter application, both the front end and the back end, if that was a enhanced component, essentially, would need that context. So it's not perfect. And Stimulus has really, really helped solve this. Stimulus is really similar to the last thing, except we're swapping the view templates for view controllers. So it's all about using the templates that we already have, applying some extra sugar in our HTML to kind of hook up to these controllers. But there is inevitably still going to be that case that I picked that kind of Twitter case because, you know, I don't think any of the approaches that I've used before would allow me to avoid having that number 280, albeit a, you know, quite simple validation in both my front and back end if I wanted kind of that form to be nice and rich like Twitter actually is. Until Stimulus Reflex comes along. So I was kind of surprised when I started looking at this. I was like, is Stimulus like something that works with Stimulus? Stimulus Reflex work with Stimulus, or is it kind of an alternative that takes some of the patterns? And it turns out both is true. So with kind of Stimulus Reflex, those view controllers that I was on about with Stimulus, we can actually write them in Ruby. And we've kind of got this magic, which turns out to be these reflexes that kind of communicates between our front end and these view components in Ruby. Not to say that you can't use it. It's a direct replacement for Stimulus. It works very well with Stimulus itself. So you can kind of mix and match, and there are always going to be cases where you can't avoid writing, you know, a little bit of JavaScript, and I'll get to those in a bit. But it allows us to, you know, have our core business logic kind of all in one place, which is quite nice. So Stimulus Reflex is for building low JavaScript applications that kind of don't compromise. So let's have a look how it works. So I kind of got this, you know, this is the hello world of Stimulus Reflex, is a counter. So we've got a template here, and when you click the increment button, it's going to go up by 1. So we've got this data reflex here, which is calling increment on our counter reflex. We'll get to that in a minute. We've got an attribute being its step, so we're going to increment by 1 every time. And then we've got its current count, which is taken from an instance variable, which we just cast to an integer here. And then we got this, increment text and its current count being shown. So our reflex, if we were using Stimulus, our controller would be a, you know, JavaScript Stimulus controller. In this case, it's a Ruby file in the reflexes directory, and we provide this increment method where we simply grab the count, we grab the step, we sum the two, and then we set the set count to the result of that. We've got the pages controller, which on kind of first load would be 0, but we've got this set so that when our reflex has finished, it will implicitly call the pages controller, and it will do a full re-render, and it will push that result back to the browser. So we'll just set this to 0 if it's unset. So kind of how this looks in practice is our first load is, you know, good old-fashioned Rails. We're going to just grab it straight from the controller over HTTP. And then when we click the increment button, it's going to go over WebSockets to Reflex, which is going to change that count variable. It's going to call the counter action on our controller, which is going to return our view back, which Reflex is going to handle passing back to us. So number goes up. This is where I started to get a little bit skeptical this approach. I started kind of worrying that, hey, is it going to kind of be calling my controller actions all the time, and that's going to be quite inefficient for trivial bits of logic, right? I was looking at implementing on my product Tech Talks here, and if you look at this page from a kind of a data standpoint, we have a lot of models in here. So, you know, the controller for this, I wish I could say this was actually the controller and it was efficiently loading stuff like this, but I just ran out of screen space in truth, and I kind of just put everything in includes for the sake of this presentation. But you can see it's loading 8 different models, and some of those things, for instance, the talks, there are multiple of them. It's doing a lot of stuff. It's querying a lot in the database. And if we were to kind of take this RSVP button here, and you simply wanted kind of to click the button for the number to change and an RSVP to be created, I think, you know, calling that whole thing, like actually executing that whole kind of controller, seems overkill to me. And you know, I was kind of skeptical about this being, yeah, like, surely little interactions are going to cause lots and lots of renders, loads of extra time spent on the database, and make your kind of application very prone to failure, I kind of found. But fortunately, there is a solution to this. So there is something called morphs within Stimulus Reflex. So I said that calling the controller action is its default behavior. Morphs is the alternative. So with morphs, what we do is we take our component here, like our counter, and we turn it into a partial or a view component. I'm not going to get into view components very much in this talk, but I've been working with them recently, and they're a really nice, elegant way of taking UI components and kind of turning them into Ruby classes in a kind of way that you'd probably be familiar working with decorators, except it can kind of be any UI component. It doesn't really have to be backed by a model. So yeah, I encourage you to look at that. But for the sake of this example, I'm just going to take the example that I showed you here of our counter, and we'll just wrap that in a container with an ID of counter, and then render the counter partial, passing in the current count into it. And then if you look below in our counter reflex, we've introduced this line that starts with morph. So morph takes as its first argument a selector, and then it takes its contents as its second argument. So in this case, we're just going to render the counter again with the new information that we have, and it's just going to inject in, and our controller is never going to be touched. So that kind of solves that problem. But what about when we need authentication? So the example of the RSVP status, we want to actually create an RSVP for that user. So this is handled pretty elegantly as well. The example that I've taken here is from Devise, but there's a whole authentication page on the Stimulus website, Stimulus Reflex website, and they're basically copy and paste examples. But essentially, we've got this kind of access to our current user through Warden here. And then in our Reflex, we simply need to do a delegate to the connection for the current user, and then we can just use it. We can just access the current user. We can do our RSVP creation right here. In this case, I'm going to render this kind of notice, which just to give you a little bit more of a preview of kind of the view component stuff, this is a view component, my Flash component, which takes a message and the notice type as a symbol. And then we can do multiple morphs, and this is actually going to happen through one kind of connection down to the browser. So we can do multiple things. It'll bundle it up and it'll send it to the client. So we're going to morph the notices to be the rendered notice, and just like we did with the counter, we're going to render this RSVP partial here and pass in our RSVP. So I want to talk about handling events. So I kind of want to talk about this because it's kind of a good example of doing something that you might normally do in Stimulus with Reflex, where we can't avoid using a little bit of JavaScript here, but we want to pass our business logic off to the server to kind of handle, so that we're all kind of working within that one domain. So here at the top, I've got a Stimulus controller and on the connect, I've got this event listener for mouse move. It's going to call on mouse move, throttled to every 50 milliseconds. And on mouse move is going to call stimulate. So this is Reflex's kind of method that you import in your application controller that allows us to talk to the back end through Reflex. So this is going to invoke the example Reflex cursor method, and it's going to give it two arguments, the current cursor X position and the cursor's Y position. So not something that we couldn't do on the client anyway, but I think it kind of illustrates that, like, you're handing this stuff off. It might be that somebody's typed in some money to do some currency conversion, and you always want currency conversion to occur on the back end. There's a bit more of a kind of practical example. Maybe I should have done that. But on our example Reflex here, we've got our cursor, takes X and Y, and then it's simply going to morph by the selected cursor, and it's going to render, I don't think we need application controller there. I don't know why I've got that in here, but it's going to render cursor with the X and Y position. So I got a little example of that just to kind of show you sort of how responsive it is. It's pretty quick, and unfortunately I don't think you can see my cursor, which is a little bit annoying, but I promise you it's there. So yeah, this is a little kind of playground that I've been looking at whilst I've just been playing with some of these tools. And obviously this is throttled as well, and with the 50 milliseconds throttling, it easily keeps up. The turnaround on this is exceptionally quick. So the thing powering all of this is a tool called CableReady. So Stimulus Reflex and CableReady are built by the same person, and Stimulus Reflex actually only uses a little bit of the power that we have at our disposal with kind of CableReady. And I just switched back by accident. Here we go. So CableReady has a lot of things that it can do over Action Cable. It can do element mutation. It can read or set attributes within the DOM. It can do navigation. It can modify styles on a local or global level. We got a lot of tools at our disposal, but Stimulus Reflex, as far as I'm aware, only ever uses element mutation. So it only ever replaces things within the DOM with the content you've provided. So there's a lot of power here. So kind of an example of how that RSVP button could be made more efficient is, instead of rendering the whole component, we could add the class active to the RSVP button and set its value to your going. And then we do these two things, and then we call broadcast on it. And much like with the morphs I said earlier, it performs that all in one go. It kind of sends that down the pipe in one go. So there's a lot of power here. I'm just starting to play around with some of this stuff, so I don't know it too in depth, but the documentation for it is absolutely fantastic, and they've got a huge amount of examples on the CableReady site as well. So just Oh my gosh, I realized I've not been showing the right thing over there. Let me rewind just slightly. I'm sorry about that. Somebody should have said something. What I was saying, this is using action cable to update the active class on the button and set its value here. And yeah, so to kind of wrap up, looking at Stimulus Reflex and CableReady, Reflex is really simple. It's kind of elegant in the sense that if you're doing kind of big changes, it automatically delegates to re-rendering the whole page and just replacing it. It's really performant because it's happening over WebSockets. And the simplicity also kind of comes from, you know, if you've ever kind of worked with React or Vue with a Rails application, for instance, you'll kind of know that you can't take all of the things that you kind of take for granted with Rails, like your view helpers, like your routes even. You just can't use them unless you pass them into it through you know, top level props and things like that. So it really allows you to kind of simplify your workflow. You get a lot of performance from Stimulus Reflex because it is WebSockets, and morphs allow you to be quite selective with the content that you want to mutate. And even more so with CableReady, where you have a lot more finite control over what you're morphing on the client side. So yeah, better performance and also a heck of a lot more control with CableReady, kind of using it raw out of the box, but not quite as much simplicity. So that's everything that I kind of have for you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.